Chapter 3. A Gadfly in Philadelphia. There is no use in trying to capture a runaway slave in Philadelphia. I believe the devil himself could not catch them when they once get here. Anonymous Slave Master. 1. A genial New Jersey farm boy named Isaac Tatum Hopper was just one among the many young men packed off by their parents in the hamlets surrounding Philadelphia in the years after the Revolution, in hope that he would make his fortune in the great city. By the end of his life, he would be a legend, a venerated figure who appeared on public platforms with William Lloyd Garrison, Lucretia Mott, and other abolitionist luminaries. But arriving in the nation's then capital in 1787, the year of the Constitutional Convention, he was merely a 16-year-old tailor's apprentice, new to city life and hoping for adventure. Unusual for his time, even among abolitionists, he was unaffected by color prejudice. He traced his sympathy for blacks to an elderly African farmhand named Mingo who, when Hopper was a small child, had recounted to him in tears how he had been kidnapped from his home across the sea by slave traders. Soon after Hopper's arrival in Philadelphia, he encountered his first fugitive, an enslaved sailor who had jumped ship and was desperate to escape recapture. Wanting to help in some way, Hopper asked among his neighbors until he heard about a Quaker in rural Bucks County who was reputed to be a good friend to colored people. He then found someone to provide the fugitive with a letter of introduction and directions to the man's house where, Hopper was later assured, the sailor was kindly received and provided with a job. The experience taught Hopper two simple but lasting lessons: that he could make the difference between slavery and freedom for a fellow human being, and that with imagination it was possible to hide a fugitive where no one could find him. Nowhere in the United States was the atmosphere of democratic change more palpable than in Philadelphia. As Hopper wandered its cobbled lanes, he mingled with Quakers in their distinctive broad-brimmed hats, immigrants from Ireland and Germany, French refugees from the Bloody Revolution and Saint-Domingue, indentured servants, free blacks, and slaves. He marveled at the temple-like public buildings that self-consciously evoked the classical inspiration of the Founding Fathers, and at the flotillas of tall-masted brigs moored in the Delaware River, proclaiming that the city of 70,000 was not just the nation's only metropolis, but one of the greatest ports in the world. Philadelphia's wealth was everywhere to be seen. At the same time, the capital also presented a panorama of appalling poverty, crime, and disorder of a magnitude never before encountered in North America. The poor and disenfranchised could be thrown into prison for minor transgressions without evidence or trial, while the constables charged with maintaining order were notoriously corrupt, ready for any low business provided it were profitable. Epidemics aided by inadequate sanitation carried people away by the scores and the hundreds. The French traveler C.F. Volney reported that the area around the docks where many blacks lived exceeded in public and private nastiness anything ever beheld in Turkey. While thousands of men and women who had spent decades in bondage were experimenting with liberty for the first time in their lives, African Americans were excluded from most schools, denied the right to vote, barred from many public places, and relegated mostly to menial occupations as chimney sweeps, woodcutters, casual laborers, and domestics. Although slavery still existed in Pennsylvania, as it did almost everywhere in the United States, nowhere else was the concept of freedom widening so rapidly for so many people. In 1780, more than 80 years before the Civil War, the state's emancipation law, the country's first, declared that while slaves born before that year were to remain in bondage, those born after that date would automatically become free when they reached their 28th birthday. The law also effectively ended slave trading locally by barring the purchase of new slaves within the state and mandating that any personal slaves brought from out of state would automatically become free after 6 months' residence in Pennsylvania. By 1800, all but a few masters within the city had voluntarily manumitted their slaves, while in the surrounding region slave owners were discovering that their once docile property could walk away from them with comparative ease. At a time when slavery was flourishing as never before in the South, and still widely tolerated in the North, word spread rapidly that Philadelphia was a haven for those who would be delivered from bondage. In 1800, a naval ship that captured 2 slave-trading vessels off the coast of Delaware delivered 134 Africans to the city to be set free. Quaker planters in the West Indies, yielding to the abolitionist pressure of their co-religionists, sent their manumitted slaves to Philadelphia by the hundreds. Philadelphia courts also freed hundreds more French-speaking slaves who had been brought from Saint-Domingue by their fleeing masters. Fugitives walked off farms in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and they made their way north by land and sea from Virginia and Maryland. For the city's African Americans, little was certain but uncertainty, however. Success in reaching Philadelphia was still no guarantee of safety. Because the State Emancipation Act did not apply to runaways, fugitives were detained in the county jail until their owner was notified. If no owner appeared, the law provided that a runaway could be sold or set free at the discretion of the local court. The outcome depended less on precedent than on the vagaries of individual magistrates, whose personal biases, particularly about slavery, were as much a factor in their decisions as their knowledge of the law or lack of it. Runaways were numerous, vulnerable, and largely unprotected. Fugitives never knew which white person might direct them to a friendly magistrate, help them find a job, and transport them to a farm outside the city where they couldn't be found, or report them to the authorities, lock them up and send for their master, or kidnap them and sell them into slavery again across the Maryland state line. Philadelphia was destined to become the country's first laboratory of abolition, but it would take a form much different from the orderly one envisioned but never brought to fruition by Thomas Jefferson. The Founding Fathers had provided the early abolition movement with a secular ideology by bestowing upon it the patriotic themes of natural rights and political empowerment. But their repeated efforts to legislate peaceful emancipation had tested the nation's commitment to its revolutionary ideals and found it grievously wanting. The hard work of emancipation thus increasingly fell to Americans of a different type. They were not the aristocratic products of the Enlightenment, but men and women driven by a religious imperative that the rationalist Jefferson disdained, in league with the free blacks whom he feared with an almost skin-crawling disgust. An engraving of Isaac Hopper, made later in life, shows a rather short, stout man, oval-faced and clean-shaven, with a small, firmly set mouth and long, wavy hair. Hopper was friendly with the exiled Joseph Bonaparte, who lived near Philadelphia, and the former king of Italy enjoyed pointing the Quaker out to acquaintances as the nearest resemblance he had ever seen to his brother Napoleon, the deposed Emperor of France. Most of what is known about Hopper's early life is found in a biography written by his protégé, the abolitionist writer Lydia Maria Child, in 1853, a year after his death. What comes through, along with an impression of unflappable self-possession and steely determination, is an impish delight in adventure that found its outlet in the hide-and-seek played by hunter and fugitive, and dramatic face-to-face confrontations with furious masters who, it was said, had abundant reason to dread Isaac T. Hopper as they would a blister of Spanish flies. Although not born a Quaker, Hopper was linked to the Society of Friends through his uncle, a tailor, to whom he was apprenticed, and in 1795, at the age of 24, he was formally received into the sect. He embraced his new faith with the unflagging enthusiasm of a convert, shunning music and dancing as a useless and frivolous pursuit, and as a matter of Quaker principle, refusing to pay taxes to maintain the state militia, compelling the authorities to collect the tax in kind by carrying off pieces of his furniture. A tenacious traditionalist, he continued to wear buckled shoes, high stockings, knee-length trousers, and broad-brimmed Quaker-style hat long after they had gone out of style. The Quakers soon recognized in Hopper's combination of stubbornness, conviction, and gentleness of manner a talent for what a much later age would call social work. In April 1796, Hopper was elected to membership in the Quaker-dominated Pennsylvania Abolition Society, the first organization in the United States to proclaim abolition as its explicit goal. He was appointed first to a charitable committee whose members visited the homes of the black poor to collect information on their needs, to help find them jobs, and to arrange education for their children, an experience that greatly deepened his insight into the life of the city's African Americans and provided him with innumerable contacts that would later prove invaluable in his underground work. In the meantime, he also served as an overseer for Philadelphia's first school for black children and as a teacher in a school for black adults, where he taught classes 2 or 3 evenings a week. In 1801, the Abolition Society handed him a new and far more challenging assignment: to investigate and represent before the law the claims of blacks who asserted that their liberty was being denied them illegally. Some of these were the victims of attempted kidnappings and others of mistaken identity. Still others, though they dared not admit it publicly in a city where many in authority were ready to send them back to their masters, were really fugitive slaves. In the first years of the new century, Hopper and his collaborators inside Philadelphia and in its surrounding countryside became what can fairly be described as the first operating cell of the abolitionist underground. Their numbers were few and their reach was limited, but the techniques that they developed eventually became a model of cooperation across racial and class lines, bringing together middle-class white tradesmen, Quaker farmers, black stevedores, and other African Americans in a collaborative effort that functioned with little or no central direction and no distinctions of rank. Of course, they did not call their activities the Underground Railroad. The invention of iron railways still lay a generation in the future. Hopper and his friends hardly thought of what they were doing as a system at all, but rather as the private actions of a handful of like-minded men, and apparently they were all men at this time, as far as can be known, doing what their individual consciences required them to do. Hopper, the most active of them, certainly had no grand national scheme in mind. He was no strategist. Rather, he led by example, bequeathing to the activists who followed him an ethic of unflinching personal responsibility, boldness, and quiet self-sacrifice. In 1804, a black man in his mid-30s appeared at the offices of the Abolition Society and explained that he was a slave to Pierce Butler, a senator from South Carolina, but had lived most of the last 11 years with his master in Pennsylvania. Butler now intended to take him to Georgia. The black man, Ben, was married to a free woman and did not want to leave her. The Society's governing committee agreed that since Ben had lived in Pennsylvania far longer than the 6 months stipulated by law, he was clearly entitled to his freedom. A writ of habeas corpus was obtained, and Isaac Hopper was chosen to serve it upon Butler at his Chestnut Street home. Butler, a tall, lordly-looking man, imperious in manner, ordered Hopper out, denouncing him as a scoundrel. Said Butler, "I am a citizen of South Carolina. The laws of Pennsylvania have nothing to do with me." It was as if, in Butler's mind at least, the two men lived not just in different states, but in different countries, which in a sense they did. Butler appeared in court to defend his property, as he saw it, maintaining that as a member of Congress he was allowed to keep his slave in Pennsylvania as long as he pleased. A lawyer appointed by the Society to represent Ben argued that the law to which Butler referred had only applied as long as Congress met in Philadelphia, but that it had become a dead letter once the government had moved to the new capital at Washington. To Butler's fury, his slave was declared a free man on the spot. As the pacifist Hopper continued to hustle about the waterfront on his missions of aid, he probably never imagined that the underground that he was inventing would eventually extend its reach across every northern state, and that it would help bring the nation to the brink of civil war. 2. The underground borrowed much from both the tightly disciplined organization and the self-contained style of the Society of Friends. Quakers had themselves been a persecuted minority both in England and in the North American colonies, and they knew that their survival depended on protecting the integrity of their community against outsiders, regardless of their internal disagreements. Moral opposition to slavery was a core Quaker tenet, although political activism was not. Even those who disliked Isaac Hopper's activities at least tolerated them. Many Quakers strongly opposed political engagement and law-breaking, and others, whatever their moral opposition to slavery, were deeply racist. But such internal struggles were almost never aired publicly. Turning in a fellow Quaker to secular authorities for practicing his religion as he saw it was virtually unthinkable. Thus, it often would prove easy for fugitives to disappear in plain sight in Quaker communities, even where only a small minority might be directly involved in underground work. Hopper's opponents, and there were many in a city where abolitionist sentiment was far from universal, attempted to dismiss him as a meddlesome Quaker. At least once, a magistrate infuriated by Hopper's unyielding defense of a fugitive slave had him thrown bodily out of the courtroom. For years he lived with threats of assassination, attacks on his family, and arson against his house. But to Hopper none of this seemed to matter. Anti-slavery work was for him a profoundly religious act. We may perform works of benevolence and kindness that are acceptable to God and approved of men, which require but little self-denial, Hopper wrote in one of the few documents in his own hand that still survives. But when duty calls us to engage in such that are unpopular, and in the discharge of which we risk the loss of friendship of those we love to be faithful therein, requires more devotion to principle and more firmness than many possess. And yet it is the path which leads to the enjoyment of that peace and consolation which the world can neither give nor take away. Hopper and his allies were heirs to a spiritual revolution that had been gathering force for more than a century. By the early 19th century, this revolution was transforming more and more Americans' ideas about slavery and race on, at least arguably, a far deeper level than the lofty intellectualizing pronouncements of Enlightenment philosophes. The earliest American critiques of slavery were rooted in powerful biblical injunctions. It is most certain that all men, as they are the sons of Adam, are co-heirs, and have equal right unto liberty and all their outward comforts of life. Samuel Sewall, a distinguished jurist in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, wrote in 1700, citing Psalms chapter 115, verse 16, God hath given the earth unto the sons of Adam, and hath made of one blood all nations of men, for to dwell on the face of the earth. He also cited Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, and seeing God hath said, He that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. It was also held by the Puritans that blacks as well as whites could be among the spiritually elect, a principle of profound importance, making clear as it did that the life and welfare of slaves could be sacred in the eyes of God. Puritan churches sometimes even admitted slaves to membership, a privilege that was denied to whites, the majority of them, in fact, who were deemed spiritually unworthy. Cotton Mather, best remembered for his religious bigotry, pressed vigorously for the education of slaves, asserting that there might be some elected ones among the Negroes. He declared in 1706 that, who can tell but that God may have sent this poor creature into my hands, so that one of the elect may by my means be called, by my instruction be made wise unto salvation. Evangelical Methodists and Baptists also stressed the equality of all souls before God, and would produce many of the staunchest foot soldiers of the abolitionist underground. However, Quakers dominated the early phase of the anti-slavery movement well into the 19th century. Even after actual leadership had passed to other hands, traditions that were associated with Quaker thought and practice, especially the doctrine of non-resistance, continued to exercise significant influence among abolitionists. Beginning in the late 1600s, the Quakers had steadily examined the moral consequences of slavery. They had come, by painful stages, to believe that they had an inescapable duty to combat it in every way possible, short of violating their doctrinal commitment to pacifism. As early as 1671, the Quakers' founder, George Fox, asked his followers to imagine themselves in the plight of the slave, and urged those who owned slaves to train up their Negroes in the fear of God, to use them mildly and gently, and after certain years of servitude to set them free. The first explicit protest against slavery in the North American colonies was articulated by the Quakers of Germantown, Pennsylvania, near Philadelphia, who stated in 1688, "Now, though they are black, we cannot conceive that there is more liberty to have them as slaves, as there is to have other white ones. And those who steal or rob men, and those who buy or purchase them, are they not all alike?" By the middle of the next century, Quakers generally had come to believe that kind treatment alone was inadequate to address the fundamental evil that permeated the whole institution of slavery in all its ramifications. The Quaker campaign against slavery was part of a broader spiritual reformation that was gathering force within the sect, calling upon members to return to a life of deeper simplicity, which also entailed educating their children apart from non-Quakers, avoiding marriage with outsiders, and shunning such vain customs of the world as music, theater, and art. In explaining their hostility to slavery, Quakers most often cited the Golden Rule, a potent principle that everyone in the intensely Christian nation could easily understand. More subtly, their opposition to slavery was rooted in their belief that a universal divine light was manifest in the soul of every person, female and male, black and white, and that to claim ownership of another human being was not only a moral, but a spiritual travesty. In addition, slavery represented an inexcusable indulgence, a contradiction to the kind of plain life that was required by their faith. Countless Quakers, including Isaac Hopper, were influenced by the widely quoted writings of John Woolman of New Jersey, who in the 1750s argued that emancipation of the slave was crucial to personal salvation. How, Woolman demanded, could a slave-holding friend expect to gain salvation when he bore the sin of slavery on his soul? "The color of a man avails nothing in matters of right and equity," he wrote. "Negroes are our fellow creatures, and their present condition amongst us requires our serious consideration. We know not the time when those scales, in which mountains are weighed, may turn, and whenever gain is preferred to equity, there is real cause for sorrow to all such whose love of mankind stands on a true principle." The dawning recognition that slavery might entail real spiritual consequences provoked crisis for many, as it did for Samuel Nottingham, a Quaker who, as a result of marriage, was horrified to find himself the owner of hundreds of slaves, a spiritual and practical catastrophe that left him feeling pierced through with very many sorrows. Around the same time, Quakers began to press for the religious education of slaves, a cause championed most prominently by another Philadelphian, a French Huguenot convert to Quakerism named Anthony Benezet, who around 1750 began tutoring adult blacks at his home on Chestnut Street. Benezet envisioned the eventual and complete integration of black and white Americans, but the prospect of sudden mass emancipation was more than he, and for that matter almost any other white man of his time, could handle. How would such a people be prevented from becoming a prey to their ignorance and passions, and a sad annoyance to their neighbors? He worried. For Benezet, education was the answer. In the course of 20 years of teaching, Benezet helped convert Benjamin Franklin and others to abolitionism by demonstrating that his students were capable of the same level of achievement as whites, thus undermining popular assumptions about black intellectual inferiority. Far ahead of his time, he also taught his black students that it was slavery, rather than any inherent racial differences, that bred ignorance and degradation among African Americans. The capstone of his life was the establishment in 1773 of a school for free black and slave children, of which Isaac Hopper would later, in 1799, become an overseer. As the century progressed, there was much preaching on the subject of slavery wherever Quakers gathered. In the 1770s, slaveholding was made a disownable offense by the yearly meetings of Philadelphia, New England, and New York. Other meetings soon followed suit. In eastern North Carolina, members who still held slaves were warned to be earnestly and affectionately advised to clear their hands of them as soon as they possibly can. In every Quaker community, committees were appointed to labor with such friends as remain in the practice of holding their fellow men in a state of slavery, endeavoring to convince them of the iniquity of such practice. Even so, manumission was a process rather than a single event. Quakers belonging to the Nine Partners meeting in Dutchess County, New York, later an important link in the Underground Railroad, took 7 years to free all their slaves, completing the process in 1782. Quakers in Westbury, Long Island, did not succeed in freeing all their slaves until 1798. Social pressure within the Quaker community was uniquely effective. Quakers were already segregated by dress, speech, religious services, opposition to taking oaths, and the marriage ceremony. Deviations from orthodoxy were punished with disownment, a public and deliberately discomfiting proclamation that the individual concerned was in a state of spiritual disharmony with his or her fellow friends. In the matter of slavery, as well as other doctrinal issues, the Quakers demanded total commitment. As one tract put it, "In the Christian warfare there must be no reservation."
This ends Disc 2. Bound for Canaan, Disc 3.
3. Although the Quaker-led Pennsylvania Abolition Society did not regard itself as a subversive organization, it was a kind of culture dish that brought together men, and if indirectly, a few women who were uncompromising in their opposition to slavery, morally committed to emancipation, and pragmatic in their determination to put fugitives beyond the reach of their masters. No one was more pragmatic than Hopper. A man of instinct and action, he was a type that would often appear along the lines of the Underground Railroad. His home near the riverfront, at the corner of Dock and Walnut Streets, was both a clearinghouse and a place of refuge for fugitives and kidnap victims. Hopper explained his motivation by citing biblical precepts that any American could understand, and that the underground would use to justify its defiantly illegal work for decades to come. Once, when he was summoned to court as a witness in a slave case and was asked what course of action Quakers were expected to take when a fugitive came to them, he first replied, "I am not willing to answer for anyone but myself." "Well," pressed the magistrate, a Mr. Ingersoll, "what would you do in such a case? Would you deliver him to his master?" "Indeed I would not," answered Hopper. "My conscience would not permit me to do it. It would be a great crime, because it would be disobedience to my own dearest convictions of right. I should never expect to enjoy an hour of peace afterward. I would do for a fugitive slave whatever I should like to have done for myself under similar circumstances. If he asked my protection, I would extend it to him to the utmost of my power. If he was hungry, I would feed him. If he was naked, I would clothe him. If he needed advice, I would give him such as I thought would be most beneficial to him." Hopper always preferred a legal attack to a physical one, and to manipulate the law rather than to break it. He was the first abolitionist to vigorously exploit the possibilities of the new, less stringent state laws to help fugitives. His many successes suggest that his adversaries were still operating under an outdated idea of what was legal and possible, assuming as they always had that the law would continue to protect slaveholding, when in fact it had decisively shifted, at least in Pennsylvania, in favor of abolition. As one judge told Hopper, when the evidence for and against freedom was evenly balanced, it was always a duty to decide in favor of liberty. Hopper was unflagging in his search for loopholes. By employing clever tactics that befuddled professional lawyers and unfriendly magistrates alike, he sometimes managed to keep cases pending as long as 3 or 4 years, until a fugitive's claimants were worn out and ready to settle. Urged to become a professional lawyer, he declined, saying that he preferred to resist temptations that might lead him away from the simplicity of Quaker belief. On one occasion, he agreed to help a young woman who had escaped from Virginia and had lived free in Philadelphia long enough to raise a family there. Tracked down by her former master, she begged Hopper for help. He knew that under the fugitive slave law, the master was entirely within his rights to carry her back to Virginia. He offered to buy her from the Virginian, but was turned down. Undeterred, Hopper showed up with the woman in city court and promised to be responsible to the United States for seeing that she would return the following day for a ruling on her status. He also promised personally to pay a $1,000 bond if she failed to appear. This was deliberate double talk on Hopper's part, since he knew quite well that the United States government had no claim of its own on the woman and no jurisdiction in the case. Nor probably did he have the money. Nevertheless, this was agreed to as reasonable by the court and the slave owner, both of whom had missed Hopper's verbal sleight of hand. Next morning, all the parties were in court except the fugitive, who with her family had been sent away to safety during the night. When the magistrate stated that Hopper would have to forfeit the bond, the Quaker pointed out to the master's chagrin that, since the federal government was not party to the case, there was no basis for a Philadelphia court collecting a fine in its name. When the law failed, Hopper could call on a web of friends and collaborators. His network was primitive but efficient. Spies among black dock workers, laborers, and domestics alerted abolitionists when a kidnapping was taking place or when a constable or a slave master was in the city stalking a fugitive. The story of a fugitive from Virginia named Ben Jackson makes it clear that when necessary, Hopper was even able to call on friends in the constabulary and the courts. Jackson had been serving as coachman for a friend when he was caught and arrested by his former master. He was jailed, pending the issuance of a permit authorizing the master to take his property back to Virginia. He managed to get word of his predicament to Hopper, who arranged with the constable on duty at the jail, a man who sympathized with the poor victim of oppression, to have the prisoner brought to court ahead of schedule. Almost certainly with Hopper's connivance, the justice before whom the case was heard, a man who detested slavery and was a sincere friend to the colored people, declared that since the complainant, Jackson's master, was absent, the presumptive evidence indicated that Jackson was a free man, and ordered him released. By the time his master arrived at the appointed time, Jackson was gone for good. Hopper clearly relished the dramatic role that he played in more than a few rescues. Once, Hopper sneaked up the stairs of a home and snatched a pistol from the hand of a partially blind man who was threatening to shoot anyone who interfered with his flogging of a slave girl. Another time, learning that a boat had left Philadelphia with a kidnapped boy on board, Hopper obtained a horse and raced alongside the Delaware River to the vessel's next landfall, arriving just in time to seize the boy and bring him home before he had been carried out of Pennsylvania waters. He also perfected ruses that were often used in later years by the Underground Railroad. Once, for example, when he was concealing a fugitive in his home and suspected that slave hunters were lurking about, he hired a black man to run out of the house after dark. As Hopper suspected, several men leaped from the shadows and seized the decoy, while the real fugitive escaped out the back door and eventually to safety. Hopper even succeeded in having the decoy's assailants arrested for assault. He also boldly came to the assistance of a free man named Samuel Johnson, who had married a slave belonging to a Delaware planter named George Black. The Johnsons, who had several children, fled to Philadelphia, where Samuel found work as a wood sawyer, and his wife took in washing. 2 years later, Black learned of his slave's whereabouts and set off in pursuit. Learning that Black was in Philadelphia, Johnson sent his family into hiding while he remained at home, trusting that since he was legally free, he could be in no danger. However, Black showed up at his door with 2 constables, and when they discovered that his wife had fled, they arrested Johnson himself. When he refused to reveal his family's whereabouts, they beat him and threatened to carry him to the South and sell him. They then tied his hands and dragged him to a tavern in Sassafras Street, where they left him under guard. By now, some of Johnson's black neighbors had contacted Isaac Hopper, who hurried to the tavern and with a typical though distinctly un-Quakerly flourish, threatened to break down the door, accusing the guards and the landlord of false imprisonment. "Release that man immediately, or thou wilt be made to repent of thy conduct," he reportedly cried. The landlord eventually yielded, and Hopper was allowed to leave with Johnson, who soon rejoined his family in an unspecified place of safety. Hopper and his collaborators pioneered the technique of passing fugitives from hand to hand among members of their extended family, personal friends, Abolition Society activists, and others whom Hopper decided should be asked to live up to their principles, until they reached a permanent haven, usually somewhere in the countryside outside Philadelphia. Their protectors, in effect the first station masters of the Underground Railroad, could be expected to provide temporary shelter, assistance in finding work, perhaps some rudimentary education, and advice in adjusting to life in a free but competitive society, where each man was expected to support his own family and to fend for himself. Hopper's brother-in-law, John Tatum, often sheltered fugitives whom Hopper had forwarded to him at his farm in New Jersey, as did a friend named William Reeve, to whom he once sent a fugitive with a letter that concluded with a verse from the Bible. "Verily I say unto you, inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me." A kind of synergy was developing as local abolitionists evolved practices that would become standard procedure wherever the underground existed. Although fugitives generally seem to have been sent on by foot and unaccompanied, they were sometimes conducted on horseback across the countryside, or transported from place to place hidden in farmers' market wagons. Disguises were also used to confuse pursuers. As early as 1809, Philip Price of East Bradford in Chester County, learning that slave hunters were in the vicinity, hurried 3 fugitives, 2 men and a woman, into a thicket near his farm. Disguising the woman as a man, he advised them to emerge at dark and to follow a certain rarely used road to a designated place where they would be met by a guide with horses. Price directed his son Benjamin to take one of the horses and lead another along with some bags, as if intending to bring home a load of grist from the local mill. After collecting the fugitives, he led them to a prearranged station near the town of Darby. Chester County Quakers also received fugitives directly from Philadelphia and settled them as safely as they could on farms in the vicinity. For fugitives, however, the danger of recapture never entirely disappeared. Only a few months after Isaac Hopper had settled the fugitive John Smith in a very secluded situation in the Philadelphia hinterland, he was betrayed by a false friend to whom he had confessed his life story. Smith received the tidings that his master was on his trail with feelings of desperation amounting to frenzy, and appealed again to Hopper for help. On short notice, Hopper recruited a ship's captain to take Smith to Boston, illustrating the ability of Philadelphia abolitionists to respond creatively to pressing needs, and more importantly, suggesting that even at this early date they were beginning to conceive of a kind of national geography of freedom that extended far beyond the environs of their own city. 4. Never much of a businessman, Hopper had lived his life as if anti-slavery work were his only occupation. That, for Hopper, happy era ended abruptly in 1812. Financial problems forced him to devote himself single-mindedly to repaying personal debts that had soiled his reputation and caused his temporary suspension from the Society of Friends, which regarded solvency as a criterion of good character. Despite his efforts, he lost his home and much of his furniture to creditors, and was forced to move into a house owned by his father-in-law, in whose front parlor Sarah Hopper opened a grocery and tea shop to make ends meet. Hopper's enemies thought that he was silenced for good, but he would be heard from again in another city and with new allies, and with an undimmed ferocity of faith. In the meantime, like a kind of moral pollen, the spiritual imperative that motivated Hopper and his collaborators was also falling on other Quakers far from Philadelphia, but bound to their core religionists through the far-flung network of yearly and monthly meetings, through family ties, and more than anything else, by a community of shared values that, for many, demanded personal action. Although no organized underground yet existed much beyond Philadelphia and its surrounding counties, the kind of men who had created it and the ideas that drove them were becoming visible wherever Quakers lived. Reared in New York in the late 1700s, Timothy Rogers was a born pioneer who founded the northwest Vermont towns of Ferrisburgh and Vergennes in a region that would serve for decades as a terminus of the Underground Railroad. In 1797, Rogers recorded in his private diary an incident that vividly illustrates how the moral core of anti-slavery activism had begun to harden. It also hints at relationships that already had formed among anti-slavery Quakers in New York's Hudson Valley, which would in time become one of the trunk lines of the Underground. While attending the Quaker yearly meeting in New York City, Rogers was approached by Isaac Leggett, a friend from Saratoga in upstate New York, who broached the subject of slavery, offering the opinion that the law would soon free slaves in the state, and asking Rogers if he would be willing to hire a couple of black men in anticipation, even though they were fugitives. Rogers said that he would, on his friend's recommendation. Leggett was already in touch with slaves who wished to escape and was looking for somewhere safe to send them. En route home, Rogers was overtaken by two fugitives who identified themselves as Harry and Francis, and who told him that Leggett had directed them to follow him to Ferrisburgh. The next day as we went on, they were stopped with an advertisement, Rogers confided to his diary. Notices of the black men's escape had apparently already been distributed around the area, some 30 miles from Saratoga. Then, somewhere north of Danby, Vermont, the three were confronted by a local constable who recognized the men as fugitives, but agreed to allow the party to continue north to Ferrisburgh. Rogers conscientiously wrote to the fugitives' owners, making it clear that no matter what the men's legal status, he did not intend to return them to bondage. Some time later, presumably at Ferrisburgh, the men's owners arrived and demanded their property back. Their masters came and attempted to run on them with rope, as supposed to bind them, Rogers recorded. I being gone and they being frightened, they both ran to the woods. After 3 days I came home, heard what was done, went 4 miles to see the masters, found them very angry, threatened great things. Rogers does not describe in detail what must have been a dramatic and perhaps even violent confrontation at a public tavern, very likely in front of other citizens who may have taken sides in the affair. In any event, Rogers again refused to give up the men. The owners thereupon sued Rogers for $500 for each of the men under the terms of the Fugitive Slave Law, for the crime of aiding and assisting the fugitives' escape. In his diary, Rogers expressed some annoyance at his friend Leggett for acting prematurely. We had been too fast, but admitted that deliverance of the fugitives took precedence over his personal feelings. I thought it best to settle, for the black men were starving in the woods. But I had this satisfaction, that I had meant to do all the good I could toward freeing all slaves. So I concluded to not value interest with freedom, and bought them both for $700. That pinched me very much to pay, and then gave them their freedom. In return, Harry and Francis agreed to work for Rogers for the next 6 years as employees. The nation's fewer than 100,000 Quakers made up slightly less than 2% of the population at the turn of the century, but they exerted a moral influence far beyond their small number. Although their unfashionable dress and antique forms of speech sometimes attracted unfriendly attention, their almost universal literacy, among women as well as men, in an age when reading and writing were uncommon skills, their honesty in business and their sober habits won them widespread respect. Quaker ideas about the immorality of slavery were carried throughout the country by itinerant preachers, who brought a personal evangelical passion to their mission, warning those who continued to hold slaves that it would lead them to eternal damnation. One of these men, Roger's Vermont neighbor, Joseph Hogue, carried the message of emancipation up and down the East Coast in the first decade of the new century. One day in 1803, Hogue had received an apocalyptic vision that became famous among Quakers. He was alone in a field when an ethereal mist eclipsed the sun's brightness, and his mind was struck into a silence. A torrent of terrible volcanic images followed, revealing a dividing spirit that ravaged first the churches, then the Freemasons, then politics, not stopping until it produced a civil war in which an abundance of blood was shed in the course of the combat. The southern states lost their power, and slavery was annihilated from their borders. Traveling by carriage and horseback over appalling roads through the Carolinas and across the Appalachians into the frontier districts of Tennessee, often ill from nameless fevers and wretched food, Hogue preached with a terrific fervor wherever he went. I was led to show that the gospel, if complied with, led every true follower of Jesus Christ to endure every burden, break every yoke, and let the oppressed go free, he proclaimed. And those who did not comply therewith were not true Christians, but deceivers of themselves and therefore anti-Christians. He preached to everyone he met, drilling away at complacency, sanctimony, and self-justification. He had only contempt for those who chose to stop and curl down on their father's sins, making that a couch of security, by condemning slavery in principle, but accommodating it in practice as a burden laid upon them by their ancestors and now impossible to change. Hogue's path also took him through the much more receptive Quaker districts of the North Carolina Piedmont. Quakers had begun migrating into the area around present-day Greensboro since the middle years of the 18th century. The first wave arrived from Pennsylvania, followed in the 1770s by contingents of farmers from the overpopulated island of Nantucket, a bastion of abolitionist sentiment, a fact that was to do much to shape the peculiar vigor of abolitionist activity in their new home. Toward the end of the century, a third wave of migrants moved west from the coastal areas of the state as the political atmosphere there became increasingly unfriendly to Quakers. By the 1800s, the North Carolina Quakers formed the only sizable abolitionist community south of the border states. Though isolated, an island in an ocean of slaveholders, they were numerous and well-organized, and had close links with relatives, friends, and fellow Quakers in the Free States. They were uniquely well situated to lay a foundation for the earliest long-distance route of the Underground Railroad.